Opening up the box, inside we get a sprue and an instruction manual. I'm using my hobby clippers to cut pieces off the sprue, being careful to make sure that the flat end of the clippers are flush with the sprue to avoid any unwanted knobbles or dents. Once cut, I can carefully use some files and a scalpel to remove any seam lines. And I'm making sure to follow the instruction manual. I'm using Tamiya extra thin cement to stick things together. Sometimes the Tamiya glue doesn't work for me because you have to be so quick, so I also use Revel plastic glue. I took out the needle applicator as they usually get clogged and it can be quite frustrating. You can use a cocktail stick to help with the application of plastic glue. You can also use a mold line remover in place of a scalpel. If there is a large knobble on the piece after it's been removed from the sprue, you can go back in with your hobby clippers. Just be careful. On the instructions, it says not to glue the head onto the snowman, which I will follow. However, if you have not made yours yet, I would strongly advise magnetising the inside of the body and the head of the snowman before you build it, to prevent losing the head. You can use Tamiya extra thin cement to melt mold lines together, which can be especially useful for awkward areas or for areas with already a lot of texture. Because this model already has a scenic base, I'm checking to make sure that all the parts will fit together nicely. I'm using blue tack to hold them down temporarily and deliberately not gluing the parts onto the base yet, so I can make the painting process easier for me. Once I've done that, I'm starting off with some grey surface primer. I'm then using some matte black all over. So I have a better idea of where I want the light to fall, I'm taking some pictures of the model, shining a torch in each angle, and then using that for my reference. Using my reference photos, I'm using some white ink to create the highlights. To get the blue tack off, I'm using a cocktail stick to gently lift it off. To make things easier for my hands, I'm drilling some small holes into inconspicuous areas, which I will then insert a paper clip with some super glue, and then insert this into a small cork. I'll do this with all parts. To give me a head start of the process, I'm going to be doing some underpainting. If you watched my How to Paint a Wizard tutorial, it explains a little bit about how it works. Granted that this was the colour purple, but this time we are focusing on the colour green and red, as it is Christmassy after all. We'll be using yellow for the highlights and blue for the shadows. As we all know, blue and yellow make green, so it helps to tint the shadows a little bit more turquoise and the highlights a little more lime green. Blue and yellow also work very well for red, as the yellow will tint the red to appear more orange, and with the blue it will turn more purple. All combinations used contrast with each other extremely well. This is important for miniatures as they're so small, and you need high contrast levels to make them stand out and appear more visible on the tabletop or from far away. For the blue, I'm using Caledor Sky on both goblins, using the zenithal highlight and reference images as a guide. For the yellow, I'm using Daemonic Yellow from ArmyPainter. Once the underpainting is completed, I'm using Mephiston Red on the larger goblin. For the small goblin, I'm using Caliban Green. For the snowman and the base, I'm using London Grey on the dark areas of the zenithal that we did earlier. Then I'm using Silver Grey on the lighter areas. I'm also using the Silver Grey to fill in the white areas on the main gobbo. as well as on the smaller grot. Not forgetting the snowballs either. Next, I'm using some German Grey on the snowman's hat, the smoke on the grenade, and the Gobbo's boots. I'm also using it on the gun. I forgot to mention earlier when building, I used my drill to make a little hole down the barrel of the gun. I'm also covering the body of the clock with German Grey and the inside with light grey. I'm using dark rust to the trousers and the boots on the grot, as well as the holster and the leather on the gun. Using silver grey again, I'm going over the white of the hat on the grot. I'm also using some Mephiston Red on the grot stockings. I'm using dark rust again to cover the shawl on the grot. And I'm filling in the rope with Karak stone. For the skin, I'm starting off with Warboss green and covering all areas. Where the light hits the skin, I'm using Ogryn Camo and trying to blend it in with Warboss green in very thin layers. Next, I'm using a combination of Mephiston Red, Pink Horror and Warboss Green on the tips of the nose and ears, as well as on the cheeks and lips, to give a sort of frost-nipped effect, as they are out in the snowy cold. I'm then using Waaagh flesh on all the shadow areas of the skin, just to help blend things together a little better and increase those contrast levels. I'm reworking into the flushed areas again. For the Christmas lights on the grot's hat, I'm starting off with some Xerus Purple, and then using some Orange Brown on the other one. For the gold star on the grot's hat, I'm using Dwarven Gold. I'm then using some Screamer Pink on the inside of the mouth. For the teeth, I'm using Silver Grey. And I'm using Thousand Suns Blue for the eyes, with Ahriman Blue for the highlights. For the metal part of the snowball, I'm using some Iron Warriors. As well as on the clock bells, I previously base coated the clock body with Xerus Purple. Just like we did with the grot, I'm using Pink Horror, Mephiston Red and Warboss Green to tint the tips of the nose, ears, lips and cheeks. I'm using Apothecary White all over the snowy and white areas. I'm also using some Agrax Earthshade on all the brown areas of the grot and on the holster. I'm using Dark Angel's Green on the hat and the clothes of the grot. For the metal and inside of the clock, I'm using Nuln Oil, as well as on the gun. I'm using Caliban Crimson on the red stockings of the grot. On the snowy areas, I'm dry brushing over the lighter areas with Silver Grey. For the highlights on the brown, I'm using Chocolate Brown. And for the green clothes, I'm using Warpstone Glow for the highlights. On the stockings, I'm using Wazdakka Red for the highlights. I'm also using Agrax Earthshade on the rope. There's another Christmas light on his waist that I'm filling in with Thousand Suns Blue and highlighting with Ahriman Blue. For the clock, I'm highlighting the silver areas with Runefang Steel, and filling in the hands with matte black. I'm using Genestealer Purple for the highlights and also doing some light scratches on the side for extra detail. I'm going back in with Warpstone Glow for the highlights on the hat, as well as Silver Grey on the white areas. I'm brightening up the orange light on his hat with Troll Slayer Orange, and the purple one with Impish Rouge. I'm highlighting the gun with London Grey, and the holster with Chocolate Brown. I'm using German Grey for the base coat on the cowl, and using Dryad Bark for the arms of the snowman. I'm using Iron Warriors for the metal area, and then filling in the midsection with silver grey, and the other charcoal areas with German grey. With Warpstone Glow, I'm making little lines all the way around, and then filling in the lines to make a striped effect. I'm using Iron Warriors again to fill in the tiny screws all around, and I'm using Mephiston Red to cover the button on top. I'm doing another coat on the snowman's hat with German grey, and doing some rough highlights with London grey. I'm then going over it with Nuln Oil. I did some lines to look like wood grain with Gorthor Brown on the arms, and then did some lighter lines with Kislev Flesh. I highlighted the green leaves with Warpstone Glow, and highlighted the metal with Runefang Steel, and then just the rim of the button with Wazdakka Red. For the charcoal, I highlighted this with light grey, and then went over them with Nuln Oil. I base coated the skull on the hat with silver grey, and base coated the ribbon in Caliban green, highlighting with Warpstone Glow. I covered the candy cane with an even coat of silver grey. I started making some lines with Warpstone Glow all around the candy cane, and did the same with Mephiston Red. To colour the skull, I'm using Agrax Earthshade, and I'm highlighting the other charcoal bits with light grey. I'm also using silver grey to highlight the skull. With Thousand Suns Blue for the eyes, highlighted with Ahriman Blue. For the ball on the gun, I'm using Impish Rouge. On the gobbo, I'm washing down the white areas with Apothecary White, along with the snowballs. I also highlighted the ball with Impish Rouge mixed with some white. I'm going over the rope with Karak Stone, and the metal with Iron Warriors. Moving back onto the gobbo, I'm going over the white with silver grey in a dotted motion to pick up the raised areas, and then lightly dry brushing the area. For the gold star, I'm using Dwarven Gold. I'm also dry brushing the snowballs with silver grey, along with the base. For the trousers, I'm doing a wash with Agrax Earthshade, and then highlighting with Mournfang Brown and Scrag Brown. I'm base coating the belts in German grey, and highlighting the boots with light grey, as well as the belt. I'm base coating the cloth with Mephiston Red, and doing a wash of Caledor Crimson all over the red areas. I'm using Nagaroth Night to accentuate the shadows, and Evil Sun Scarlet for the highlights. For the brightest points, I'm using a tiny bit of Squig Orange. I'm painting the beard with London Grey, and touching up the weapons with some Mephiston Red, and washed the beard with Nuln Oil. And I also used a little bit of Runefang Steel on the glasses. The other gold stars were covered in Dwarven Gold. I used silver grey for the teeth, and Runefang Steel for the pin in his mouth. I used Mournfang Brown for the strap on his face, highlighted with Scrag Brown. His earrings were done with Dwarven Gold, and the silver on the snowball grenade was done with Iron Warriors. There was some rope on his hat which I did with Karak Stone. And I used Thousand Suns Blue for his eyes, with Ahriman Blue for the highlights. I used Caledor Crimson on the smoke, and used a couple layers of Trollslayer Orange to try and build up some colour towards the snowball. I then went back over with German Grey, making little circles on the raised areas so you could see the light coming through the recesses. I highlighted the beard with light grey. I then used some Xerus Purple to make some stripes on the metal. I used Runefang Steel on the top of the bauble and base coated the rest with silver grey, before colouring it with Warpstone Glow and highlighting it with Moot Green. I base coated the wires on the base with Mephiston Red, highlighting with Evil Sun Scarlet. I coloured the Christmas lights with Warpstone Glow Impish Rouge, Mephiston Red, Thousand Suns Blue, and Trollslayer Orange. For the grenades, I used Iron Warriors. And Runefang Steel for the highlights. I used Xerus Purple for the ball on the floor, highlighting with Genestealer Purple. I used Iron Warriors for the metal supports. And to pull off the OSL effect, I used some Trollslayer Orange and Impish Rouge on the Christmas lights of the Grot's hat, as well as Ahriman Blue on his body. I started trimming off the pins so I could see if light would hit any of the pieces once on the base. I then used the respective colours where the light would hit on the pieces from the Christmas lights. After that was done, I went and did some smaller highlights with white. I did need to go over the base of the snowman with Iron Warriors, and then I was able to stick things down with super glue. I went over with some green and brown on the back of the grot to de-intensify the OSL. I also added a bit of pink to the clock where I'd missed a bit, and went over the rim of the base with light grey. I sprayed the whole thing with a gloss varnish, and then a matte varnish, and I just touched up with the candy cane, baubles and button with the gloss varnish again.